By the fifth morning of the white storm, Hollow Creek had stopped looking like a town. The street was gone, the church bell was packed silent in ice. Barn roofs showed only their top edges like dark ribs under a sheet. But above the valley, in a narrow bight of red sandstone, one square of yellow light was still burning. People had laughed at that light all summer. Now it was the only warm thing they could see. A half-mile above the buried street, Caleb Rusk lifted the tin thermometer from its nail and held it close to the lantern. 64 degrees. He wrote the number in his weather book. Day 5, inner room steady, wood use low, no frost on north wall. Outside, the gale struck the bluff hard enough to make loose snow leap sideways through the dark. Inside, the stove made a small, ordinary sound. A blue kettle breathed on the iron plate. Elena slept in a chair with a wool shawl around her shoulders, and under the table, Ash, the old gray shepherd, did not whine once. That bothered Caleb more than the wind. Ash had warned him about bad weather for 12 years. He had barked at thunder before it reached the ridge. He had paced before avalanches cracked loose in the high passes. But now, while Hollow Creek was being erased below them, the dogs slept like the storm had already lost. The strange part was this. Caleb had built the cabin exactly so that would happen. The town had called him a fool for choosing the worst claim on the map. No creek flat, no pasture, no proper road, just a broken shelf of red cliff that most settlers considered useless. But Caleb had not bought the land for the soil. He bought it because winter had already carved a shelter there, and before the storm ended, the people who mocked that cabin would begin climbing toward its light. 8 months earlier, there was no light in the sandstone cut. There was only dust, laughter, and a claim map spread across a counter in the Hollow Creek land office. Every new family wanted the same kind of parcel: flat ground near water, good grass for horses, room for a barn, enough soil to plant potatoes and corn. Caleb Rusk let the other men argue over those pieces. His finger moved past the creek meadow, past the wagon road, past a willow bend that made 3 ranchers lean forward at once. Then he stopped at a thin, awkward strip above town. The clerk, Abel Pike, looked over his spectacles. That ledge? Caleb nodded. Pike turned the map slightly, as if the paper might explain Caleb's mistake. There is barely room up there to turn a team. I do not need room for a team, Caleb said. A few men near the stove laughed before he finished speaking. Caleb tapped a crooked mark on the survey, where the ridge folded in on itself. There was a stone pocket on this bluff, south-facing, overhung, dry floor, windbreaks on both sides. Now the laughter grew louder. One man said it sounded like Caleb wanted to live in a badger hole. Another said he had found the only claim in Wyoming Territory where a cow would need a ladder. Caleb did not argue. Elena stood beside him, one gloved hand resting on a roll of drawings. She was used to people laughing at things before they understood them. Her father had cut stone for 40 years, and he used to say that weak rock brags, while good rock keeps quiet. Pike looked from Caleb to the map. You are passing over the best land in the valley. Caleb's finger stayed on the red bluff. That depends what you are trying to survive. The sentence killed the laughter for only a second. Then someone near the stove muttered, He is trying to survive common sense. By evening, half of Hollow Creek had heard the story. By Sunday, everyone had a name for him. Cliff Caleb, the rock squirrel, the man who paid money for shade. Caleb heard all of them. The bluff heard nothing. Years before he came to Hollow Creek, Caleb had made his living hauling flour, stove iron, blasting powder, and medical crates through the Wind River foothills. He had slept under wagons, in freight sheds, beside frozen creeks, and once inside an abandoned lime kiln because it was the only place the wind could not find him. That life taught him something most new settlers learned too late. Cold was dangerous. But wind decided where danger collected. A house in the wrong place did not just face winter, it invited winter to work on it. Caleb had watched snow behave like water. It poured around ridges, it curled into hollows, it stacked against square walls and left strange bare scars behind certain rocks. A smooth slope could bury a man by morning. A cracked shoulder of stone only 20 yards away could remain almost clean. He began to mark those places in a small weather book, where frost stayed, where old snow vanished first, where wind shouted, where wind fell quiet. The quiet places interested him most. He did not think of them as miracles. He thought of them as bargains. If a man found the right shape of land, the land would do some of the work. The red notch above Hollow Creek was one of those shapes. From below, it looked mean and useless, a wound in the cliff, a place for snakes maybe, or dry grass. But up close, it changed. A lip of sandstone projected over the opening like a natural porch roof. The back wall leaned inward, thick and dry. The floor sloped just enough for water to leave. On the east side, the cliff shoulder blocked the worst northwest wind. On the west side, a narrow rib of stone broke the cross gusts before they could gather speed. And because the opening faced southeast, morning sun entered deep into the pocket long after frost still held the valley. Caleb saw all of that in an hour. Elena saw what he missed. She knelt and pressed her palm to the ground. Then she scraped away a skin of grit and exposed hard-packed soil beneath it. "No sour smell," she said. That mattered. Dampness killed frontier houses quietly. It crept into sills. It swelled boards. It held frost where frost had no business forming. Men blamed storms when rot had been working under their floors for years. Elena stood and studied the rock face. "If we build right against the back, the wall will sweat." Caleb nodded. "Then we do not build right against it." Together, they drew the first version of the cabin in the dust with a stick. Not a cabin pasted onto a cliff, not a cave with a door on it. A cabin inside a larger shelter. The stone would take the first hit. Air would move behind the walls. The floor would stand above the ground on stone blocks. The roof would tuck under the overhang but never touch it. The cabin would have 2 skins, with packed wool and flax tow between them. A narrow vent channel would carry warm, damp air away from the coldest side. Most settlers built a house and then tried to protect it from winter. Caleb wanted winter to spend itself before it ever reached the house. That was the idea. Hollow Creek treated it like a joke. The richest rancher in the valley, Merritt Crow, rode up one afternoon in a black coat that had never seen a day of hard weather. He sat on his horse and watched Caleb mark the floor line with twine. "I have a feed barn with glass windows," Crow said. "You are building a parlor for coyotes." The men with him laughed. Caleb kept measuring. Crow leaned forward in the saddle. "When the first real storm comes, that cliff will fill like a flour barrel." Caleb placed another stake. "Then come back and tell me. I may have to dig you out first." That line spread faster than the work. Soon children were daring each other to climb toward Caleb's coyote parlor. Men stopped on the road just to point. Women at the general store lowered their voices when Elena entered, not because they were kind, but because pity enjoyed manners. The criticism that mattered came from Thomas Baird. Baird was the best builder in Hollow Creek. He had raised the schoolhouse, the livery roof, and half the cabins on the lower street. When he climbed to the red notch, he did not laugh. That made Caleb listen. Baird walked the pocket slowly. He checked the overhang. He pressed his hand to the stone. He crouched near the floor and looked at the slope. Then he said, "Rock holds night cold longer than timber." "I know. Rock can hold moisture you do not see." "I know that too. You put wood near this, and one winter will teach you regret. 2 winters will teach you ruin." Elena answered before Caleb could. "Only if the wood cannot breathe." Baird looked at her, then at the drawings. For nearly an hour they argued without raising their voices. Vent gaps, drainage trenches, raised piers, an airspace behind the rear wall, a stovepipe set high and shielded from backdraft, a small cold pantry dug into the inner slope, separate from the living wall. Baird understood every piece. That was why he distrusted the whole. "Too many conditions," he said at last. "A good house should not depend on everything working perfectly." Caleb looked out over the valley, where square cabins were being hammered onto open flats. "No," he said. "A good house should know what is coming." Baird shook his head. When he left, he touched one of the stakes with his boot. "Stone is patient. Wood is not. Remember that." Caleb did remember. All summer he remembered. The work nearly broke them. Every board had to climb the hill, every barrel of lime, every sack of wool, every pane of glass wrapped in straw. The road was no road at all, just a mule track that bent through sage and stone. Caleb hauled lodgepole from a stand 11 miles away. Elena shaped wedges, sorted nails, and kept the drawings dry under an oilcloth. Ash followed them from task to task, taking shade under the wagon when the sun was high, then rising again as if he were part of the crew. The first thing they built was not a wall. It was a channel. Caleb cut a shallow trench along the uphill side of the pocket, lined it with flat stones, and carried it around the cabin site so meltwater would pass them instead of entering beneath them. People who came to laugh at the project found a ditch and went home unimpressed. Then came the stone blocks, then the raised floor, then a frame that seemed too small to answer all the gossip it had created. By August, the cabin had shape. By September, it had its second skin. Caleb nailed the outer boards tight against the weather side, but left controlled breathing spaces where Elena marked them. The inner wall went up slower. Between the two, they packed wool, flax tow, and dried moss in measured layers, never so tight that air could not settle, never so loose that heat would run through it. The door did not open straight to the outside. It opened into the stone pocket. That meant winter would have to enter the notch, turn, lose speed, cross a protected space, and only then reach the cabin door. Caleb liked that. A storm, like a thief, wasted strength on corners. By the time the stove arrived, even the mockers had begun to climb with less laughter. Not because they believed in the place, because it was becoming too detailed to dismiss quickly. Still, the names remained: Cliff Caleb, Rock Squirrel, Coyote Parlor. Elena said the best answer to a nickname was a roof that did not leak. For a while, it seems she was right. The first cold nights came in October. Frost whitened the sage below. Smoke rose from every chimney in Hollow Creek. On the bluff, Caleb and Elena slept under 2 blankets and woke warm enough to laugh at the kettle ice outside. The thermometer inside the cabin stayed between 60 and 66 degrees with a small fire. The pantry held potatoes firm and dry. The floor did not sweat. No draft entered around the door. Caleb began recording everything: outside temperature, inside temperature, wind direction, amount of wood burned, ashes behavior, condition of the rear wall. Most people in town measured a house by how it looked from the street. Caleb measured his by what it cost to keep warm. By the second week of November, the numbers showed something hard to ignore. Compared with the cabins on the exposed lower street, the cliff cabin was using a little less than half the firewood. Not a little less. Less than half. There was one person in Hollow Creek who cared about that. Marin Bell, the postmistress, had a habit of listening more carefully than she spoke. She delivered packets to the ridge twice a month and asked to see the weather book every time. Caleb would hand it over. Marin would run one finger down the columns. She never praised him. She only said, "Keep writing." Then, in late November, the cabin failed its first test. It happened on a morning so still that frost hung on every twig like white wire. Caleb was checking the rear vent slot when he noticed a dark line on the inside wall. At first, it looked like a shadow. Then Elena touched it and lifted her fingers wet. Moisture. Not much, but enough. They pulled the board loose and found a thin ribbon of frost forming inside the wall cavity. The room felt colder the moment they saw it. Caleb had planned for wind. He had planned for snow. He had planned for groundwater. But in that section, warm air from the room was reaching a cold, dead pocket behind the inner boards. The air slowed there. It cooled. It dropped its moisture into the wall. Baird's warning came back with cruel precision. Stone is patient. Elena did not scold him. That was worse. She only asked, "Can we fix it before the deep cold?" Caleb looked at the open wall. "We have to." For 4 days, the cabin looked wounded. Boards came down. Wool came out in heavy clumps. Caleb widened the rear air path and added a small upper draw vent that could be opened or closed with a wooden slide. Elena adjusted the insulation so air could move where it needed to move and stop where warmth needed to hold. The repair was ugly. Then it was invisible. Another cold spell came. No frost appeared. Caleb wrote the result in the book. Rear wall dry after correction. Air must move, but not wander. That sentence became more important than he knew, because the storm that would make Hollow Creek remember his name was already forming far beyond the valley. In early February, the signs arrived in pieces. Ash stopped sleeping through dawn. The crows left the cottonwoods 2 days before the cold turned. Snow on the northwest benches appeared torn rather than settled, as if the wind were testing different routes. At night, the stars looked too sharp. Then the barometer fell hard. Caleb watched the needle, waited an hour, then watched it fall again. By noon, he was in town. At the mercantile, men were arguing about flour prices and a broken wagon tongue. Caleb waited until they quieted. "Something large is crossing the range," he said. "You need wood inside the houses, water filled, chimneys cleared, stock brought close. Mark your paths before snow takes them." Merritt Crow smiled without warmth. "Is the cliff speaking now?" A few men chuckled. Caleb ignored him. Thomas Baird was there, buying nails. He frowned at the door, where fine snow had begun to drift against the threshold. "What makes you so sure?" "Pressure drop, birds gone, wind shear on the benches. Ash has not settled in 2 days. Crow laughed. Now we are taking orders from a dog. Caleb looked at the room. Take them from the sky, then. That ended the laughter for longer than usual, but it did not create action. People had survived winters before. Warnings were common. Most storms promised more than they delivered. Abel Pike, now acting mayor after the old mayor left for Cheyenne, told Caleb to avoid stirring panic. Marin Bell said nothing in public, but when Caleb stepped outside, she followed him to the hitch rail. When did the pressure begin falling? Before sunrise. How much? He told her. Marin wrote it on the back of an envelope. Then she looked toward the ridge. You really believe it? Caleb tightened the cinch on his mule. I believe the valley is too open for what is coming. After that, he did not argue again. For 2 days, the ridge became preparation. Wood was stacked inside the stone pocket, not outside where drifts could take it. Water barrels were filled and pulled away from the entrance. A second latch was added to the outer gate. The pantry shelves were loaded with beans, flour, salt pork, dried apples, and sacks of potatoes. Elena put blankets in the protected space between the cabin and the cliff mouth. Caleb walked the path down toward town and hammered marker stakes where fence lines vanished in heavy snow. He wrapped the tops with strips of dark cloth so they might show against white. It seemed excessive. That was the point. A useful warning often looks foolish until the hour it becomes necessary. On the evening before the storm, snow began falling straight down. No wind, no violence, just soft flakes gathering on sage and roof and rail. Elena stood inside the stone pocket and watched the valley lamps blur one by one. Maybe it will pass south, she said. Caleb did not answer quickly. The old dog stood beside him, nose lifted, listening into the white air. Then Ash backed into the cabin and lay down by the stove. Caleb looked at Elena. No, he said. It has already chosen us. The storm arrived after midnight, not as weather, as force. One moment the valley was quiet. The next, wind hit Hollow Creek so hard that shutters slammed open on 3 houses at once. Snow stopped falling and began flying sideways. Loose powder became a moving wall. In minutes, the road disappeared. In an hour, fences were gone. By dawn, the town looked as if it had been shoved under a white hand. The temperature dropped past 30 below, then lower. By the first afternoon, several doors could not be opened from inside. Men crawled through windows with shovels tied to their wrists. Barn doors froze in their tracks, chimneys choked with blown ice. Wood piles that had seemed close the day before were now behind walls of packed snow. On the bluff, the storm came differently. The gale struck the cliff face, split, and tore past both shoulders of the red notch. Snow tried to enter the pocket, but much of it dropped early or spun harmlessly across the outer lip. What reached the protected space had already lost its speed. Inside the cabin, the stove worked as if it were any cold week in February. Caleb recorded the numbers. Outside, impossible to read in gusts. Inside, 65. Wood, 1 armload since dawn. Rear wall, dry. The old repair held. That mattered more to him than warmth. A weakness found in November had become a strength in February. Below them, Hollow Creek was learning the opposite lesson. Weaknesses ignored in autumn were collecting interest by the hour. On the second day, Merritt Crow's glass-windowed feed barn began to fail. Snow built against the windward wall until the pressure bowed the lower boards inward. Crow and 2 hired hands tried to clear it, but every trench filled behind them. Near dusk, the roof beam cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. The animals inside screamed once before the storm swallowed the sound. At Thomas Baird's house, the trouble was not snow weight, it was air. Ice formed around the chimney cap, then inside the upper draft. Smoke that should have climbed began to curl back through the room. Baird opened a window for air and let in a blade of cold so sharp his youngest boy cried out. He cleared the pipe once, then again. By the third day, his wife's cough had deepened, and the fire was no longer safe enough to trust. Other houses fought their own battles. A door pinned shut, a roof seam opened, a wood shed buried, a cow frozen where the rope had trapped her, a family burning chair legs because the fuel stack had disappeared 6 steps from the kitchen wall. No single failure destroyed Hollow Creek. The storm did it by making every small mistake expensive at the same time. By the 4th day, the town had stopped pretending it was only waiting out weather. It was enduring a siege. On the ridge, Caleb's weather book filled with proof. Day 3, inner room 64, wind violent, fuel low. Day 4, pantry steady, no wall frost, entrance partly drifted, cleared from inside. Day 5, inner room 63 at dawn, recovered to 65 before noon. The entries looked almost boring. That was their power. A good shelter should make disaster look smaller inside its walls. Late on the 5th afternoon, Ash lifted his head. He did not bark. He rose, stiff-legged, and stared toward the outer gate. Caleb listened. At first, there was only wind. Then something else. A dull strike, a pause, another strike. Elena was already on her feet. Caleb wrapped a scarf over his face and crossed the protected pocket. When he pulled the outer gate open, snow blew in around 2 figures that fell more than stepped inside. Thomas Baird collapsed first. His son Samuel tried to hold him up and failed. Their coats were white. Their eyelashes were frozen. Samuel's lips had gone the color of old slate. Elena dragged the boy toward the cabin while Caleb shut the gate against the storm. It took 10 minutes before either of them could speak clearly. The chimney had failed. The house had filled with smoke. Baird's wife and younger children had been taken by neighbors closer to the schoolhouse, but Thomas and Samuel had tried to reach the woodshed and lost the path back. They found one of Caleb's dark cloth stakes by accident, then another. The markers had brought them uphill. Baird sat in a blanket beside the stove, shaking so hard water spilled from the cup in his hand. Months earlier, he had stood in the red notch and explained why the cabin would rot itself apart. Now he looked at the dry walls, the raised floor, the vent slide, the shallow trench carrying blown meltwater away beneath the stones. He did not apologize at first. He was too cold for pride. Only after color returned to his son's face did Baird lower his eyes and speak. "I measured the wrong enemy," he said. Caleb put another piece of wood into the stove. "No, you measured one enemy. Winter brought all of them." Baird looked toward the door. The storm was still moving, and Caleb knew the first knock would not be the last. By morning, the path markers had become a lifeline. Word traveled the only way it could, through people risking short distances between houses. Someone told someone else that Baird had reached the cliff. Someone saw the lamp above the valley. Someone remembered the black cloth tied to the stakes. Then the climb began. A widow named Mrs. Venn arrived with 2 grandchildren wrapped in quilts. A hired hand came half dragging another man whose hands were turning waxy. Marin Bell reached the notch carrying the town mail pouch under her coat, not because the mail mattered, but because her ledger was inside it. By afternoon, Abel Pike stumbled in with 1 boot packed full of snow and no authority left in his voice. Merritt Crow arrived last among the men who had mocked Caleb loudest. He did not come on horseback. He came bent double, one arm around a ranch boy who could barely walk. No one said coyote parlor. No one said rock squirrel. Inside the Red Notch, status became a thing from another season. Elena organized the food. Caleb divided sleeping space. Baird, once his hands steadied, helped adjust the vent so that 30 breathing people would not turn safety into dampness. Marin wrote down every name that entered. By nightfall, 29 people were sheltered in and around the cliff cabin. Not comfortably, not easily, but alive. The cabin itself became the warm heart. The stone pocket became the larger room. Blankets hung as partitions. Children slept in rows, with their boots still on. A kettle passed from hand to hand. Small cups of broth were measured carefully, so everyone received heat, if not fullness. Outside, the storm kept spending itself on the bluff. Inside, people finally understood the shape of Caleb's idea. The cliff did not make the cabin invincible. It made the cabin unfair to the storm. The wind could not hit it square. Snow could not pile against the main door. Moisture could leave before it became rot. Warmth stayed longer because the house was not doing all the work alone. The land was part of the structure. That was the piece the town had missed. For 5 months they had looked at the cabin and seen a man hiding in rock. Now, sitting beneath the overhang while wind screamed past them, they understood something harder to admit. Caleb had not hidden from winter. He had studied where winter got tired. The storm ended on the 6th morning. No one trusted the silence at first. After days of screaming wind, quiet felt like a trick. Caleb opened the outer gate a few inches. Pale light entered the Red Notch. The snow outside stood nearly level with the lower lip of the opening, but the space inside remained mostly clear. He stepped out and looked down. Hollow Creek had become a map with most of the lines erased. The main street was a white swell. Fences were gone. The church roof had one broken edge. Crow's feed barn was a collapsed mound of timber and snow. Several cabins showed only chimney tops. Smoke rose weakly from places where people were still alive. Then the work began. The 29 who could stand joined search parties. Ropes were tied around waists. Shovels passed from hand to hand. Paths were cut from roofline to roofline. Doors were uncovered. Animals were freed where they could be saved. Bodies were found where they could not. The cliff cabin did not save everyone. No story that honest would claim it did. But every hour after the storm made one fact harder to avoid. The structure people called foolish had endured with less damage, less fuel, and more people inside it than any building in Hollow Creek. And Caleb had the book to prove it. 3 days after the sky cleared, Marin Bell asked him to bring the weather record to the schoolhouse. The room was colder than usual. One wall had been patched with canvas. Nearly every adult in town came anyway. Caleb placed the book on a desk. Marin read aloud, not dramatically. That was what made it worse for the men who had laughed. October cold nights. Inside 62 to 66. November, Correction. Rear wall frost eliminated after vent change. December. Fuel count. 47% of lower street average. Storm week. Inner room never below 63 while sheltering 29. Wood remaining after 6 days. More than 2 full stacks inside the notch. The numbers did what arguments had not. They removed performance from the room. Merritt Crowe stared at the floor. Abel Pike rubbed one hand across his mouth. Thomas Baird leaned forward like a student. When Marin finished, nobody spoke. Then Baird asked the only question that mattered. "Will you show me the vent path again?" That was how the change began, not with applause, with a builder asking to measure the thing he had doubted. By spring, Baird had climbed the ridge 6 times. He measured the raised floor. He copied the rear air channel. He studied the trench, the door angle, the way the stovepipe rose before it turned, the way the outer gate broke the wind before the cabin door ever opened. He did not copy Caleb's cabin exactly. No one could. The red notch belonged to that bluff. But Baird began building differently. A widow's new house turned its door away from the prevailing wind and gained a small entry chamber instead of opening straight into the kitchen. A storage cellar was dug into a dry bank with a vent high enough to breathe but low enough to stay protected. 2 barns were rebuilt with windbreak walls set apart from the main frame so snow would drop before it reached the structure. New settlers were told to watch where old snow lay in April before choosing where to build in June. Even Abel Pike changed. The next claim meeting included new advice written in plain ink at the bottom of the notice. Consider drift lines. Consider winter wind. Consider drainage before view. Natural shelter is not wasted land. Nobody mentioned Caleb in the notice. They did not have to. Every person in Hollow Creek knew which foolish ledge had rewritten the rules. Years passed. The town grew around the lesson. The lower street remained, but fewer people trusted open flatness simply because it looked easy. Houses gained storm porches. Barns gained protected approaches. Cellars got better vents. People learned to ask where the wind would put snow, not where a summer wagon would roll most smoothly. Caleb and Elena stayed in the Red Notch. The cabin darkened with smoke and weather. The sandstone above it shed flakes in the spring. Ash grew old, then older, until one winter he no longer rose when the morning sun entered the pocket. They buried him near the path markers, where he could face the valley he had watched for most of his life. Caleb kept writing in the weather book long after people stopped needing proof. Not because he wanted to be right, because the land was still speaking. A late thaw that made the rear wall damp for 2 days. A north wind that carried powder farther into the pocket than usual. A warm winter when the pantry needed more air, not less. A spring flood that proved the drainage trench should be widened by 2 stones. The lesson had never been that one man solved winter. The lesson was that winter kept asking questions. A careless house answered once. A wise house kept listening. When Caleb died, he died in the room that had stayed warm through the storm that nearly ended Hollow Creek. Elena lived there several more years, and after she was gone, the town placed a small iron marker at the mouth of the Red Notch. The words were simple. This shelter taught Hollow Creek to build with the weather, not against it. No crown, no legend, no claim that Caleb conquered the storm. He had not conquered anything. He had noticed what the wind was already doing. He had trusted the evidence before it was popular. He had let the bluff take the first blow. Decades later, travelers still climbed the old path when winter was near. They stood under the sandstone lip and felt the same strange quiet that had confused the first visitors. The wind could be tearing across the valley, lifting snow from fence posts and throwing it sideways into the road. But inside the red notch, sound changed. The air softened. The snow dropped. The cold seemed to arrive tired. That was the secret Caleb Rusk had seen before anyone else. Not that a man could defeat winter by being stubborn, but that winter, like any powerful thing, had habits. And if you learned those habits closely enough, you could build your life in the place where its strength ran out.